friend and fellow YouTuber, Wasky Squirrel, who does a review on his fountain pens in use. He does pen reviews. Has reviewed recently his Boston safety pen that came from Noodler's ink, and he also continues to use the Pierre Gustafson test, which his pen failed, and I thought, well, I'll try the Pierre Gustafson test on my pen. Well, let me explain what the Pierre Gustafson test is in the first place. It's to see if your pen ink supply can keep up with your hand. Now, I tend to write and draw very fast. Sometimes it's because I get bored easily and I have to finish a drawing more quickly than other people might take. Sometimes it's because the speed will allow me to get a very, very fine line. It's more the latter than the former. I do get bored, yes, I do get bored, but when I'm doing calligraphy and I'm making a line that's, if you stretch this all out, it might be 2 feet long, and if I'm doing that within 1 second of time, you realize that you're dragging the pen along the paper pretty quick. And I find that modern pens tend to skip when you do that. And things might be changing now because there are more fountain pen users buying more modern fountain pens, so maybe they are learning their lesson. But back in the olden days, meaning a decade ago, or maybe even 2 decades ago, the fountain pens that were made for the buying public were very stingy with their ink flow. And why were they stingy with their ink flow? Why would you want that? Because if you did that, if you shook your pen, your modern pen, you wouldn't have that happen. But an older pen, when people knew not to shake pens, they knew that there was ink ready at that nib, filling that feed area there, full of ink, ready to be able to make a thick line when you press down. Modern pens, modern pen manufacturers were afraid of this being a turnoff to pen users. And yes, it certainly would be a turnoff if that's what happened when I used my pen. But almost every single one of my pens will do this if I shake it. And I know not to shake a pen. And people in 1910 and 1920, all the way up till the ballpoint years, knew not to shake your pen. So that's one of the reasons why I suggested to Wasky to try the speed test, because many of the pens he had were modern, and I just was wondering whether the modern pens could keep up with a fastly drawn line. Now, Wasky and Wasky scribbles like this, and I scribble differently. I make calligraphic lines, and his are not perhaps as calligraphic as mine are, but they're both scribbles to a degree, and some are prettier than others. Sorry, Wasky. Anytime you add a wider line, a varied line on with a pen, whether you're scribbling or not. When you have the variety of thick and thin, it, in my book anyway, always moves towards the pretty and less towards the ugly, shall I say. I don't mean to say ugly, Lasky, I'm sorry. But anyway, when I'm doodling, I'm going up and down and pressing down and lifting up and stuff like this. And why is this pen skipping? It's not supposed to be doing that. It probably needs more ink. I was drawing with this one yesterday. Anyway, my Lasky used his Noodler's pen and found that it was skipping when he did his Pierre Gustafson test. So I was going to try this out to see if the Pierre Gustafson test done by Pierre Gustafson was going to make it skip or not. But before I do that, I just wanted to explain why this pen exists and why they were manufactured in the first place. A Boston safety pen made by the Noodler's ink company is made of hard rubber and is essentially modeled after a Moore safety pen, and I will show you some of my collection of Moore safety pens. I'll also show you a couple of Waterman safety pens as well. But the Moore safety pen, which is what this one is modeled after, were made by the Moore Company here in Boston, and were manufactured for many reasons perhaps, but a main reason for safety pens to exist was to be able to use India ink. Now, India ink has, among other things in it, shellac. And shellac, if it were to dry, shellac will completely clog a pen and you'll have trouble with it. So putting India ink in a pen like this, as much as you think it's airtight and everything, there's enough air, evidently, within this little cap part when it's closed that could cause the ink in the nib and the feed to dry and to harden and to clog. So one of the things that would prevent that from happening is if you were done with your pen, if you put your pen in the bottle of ink where it would be, the ink would be completely surrounding the nib, it would never clog because it would be submerged in the ink. So that's essentially what Boston safety pens did. Here's a demonstrator version of it. It shows the inner cap here, which I don't know if you can see. Can I zoom in here? Yes, you can see. Look at my filthy fingernails. Ignore those. There's a little rod there inside the cap. And that the top of the cap is essentially a cork. And at the end of that cork is this rod. And why is that rod there? You say the actual pen would not have this hole cut out of it. This is a demonstrator to show people how it worked. What that spike does is to keep the nib down into the ink and keep it from being accidentally pushed up, and then you'd break the nib if that spike weren't there. So the idea is you fill this with India ink, blah 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 blah, and then you pull this down and it's submerged in the ink, and then you cork it with the cap, and that would keep the nib wet. And these pens have very few parts, and they unscrew like this, and that's how Nathan's Noodler's pen would work. There's a little threading thing here. You'd pull it out the front. Right here in the back is some cork, actual cork from a cork tree. Now, Noodlers probably uses some synthetic plug with a hole in it that would keep it tight, airtight in the bottom. So if you were to buy an old Moore safety pen and get it so it would work with any kind of ink, let alone India ink, you'd probably have to replace that cork, which is not an easy job. I've never done it. Maybe I did it once back 30 years ago when I started fixing pens, but I have other things to do with my life than to do that. So anyway, here's some other more safety pens. This one has its original price sticker, number 7 cap. This was some dollars and 50 cents. $3.50 back in 1915 or whenever it was. And they came in various ways of fancification, and they also were, like this one, sterling overlay. This is sterling silver, tarnished. 1916. This was given to someone at Christmas, Xmas of 1916. Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze here. This has a stub nib in it. Now, why would people want to use India ink? Well, India ink is used by artists. They were used by court stenographers. They were used by certain accountants, especially those that had to write things that were meant to be permanent. Inks back in the olden days were not necessarily permanent. They could be washed off and a new amount could be put on your check that you sent to someone, and you'd find your bank account drawn because they added a 1 in front of the 100, and your $1,000, your $100 check was turned into $1,100, and you would be screwed. So India ink prevented that from happening to a degree, and certain records, court records, things like that, had to be done in permanent ink, which required a pen like this, or you could dip a pen in an ink pot if you wanted to do it the old-fashioned way. Why am I showing you this pen? Put it away. Artists tend to like to use India ink if they want to do a drawing that will have watercolor on top of it. Now, I don't draw that way. I tend to draw with pen and ink and leave it as pen and ink. I have, though, been having fun drawing with pen and ink using just regular non-waterproof ink and getting some rather nice results by applying water. So here's, for example, a drawing. Let's pretend this is a drawing. This is another one of my calligraphic scribbles. And I get my brush, and this brush this brush has some blue on it because I need to use it for another job. So let's wash out some of the blue. It's washed out enough. It's like my fingernails. They're clean enough. And I can go into ink that already has been applied to the page, and I can add some ink wash and some water, and it turns into a nice ink wash drawing. So I actually kind of like non-waterproof ink for this reason. And so I don't need or don't desire to use waterproof ink as much as some other artist might like. Waterman, I'm just going to show you some Waterman safety pens. Waterman had the same idea of submerging their nib in the ink when it wasn't being used. And they had a system of a screw in here that would cause the thing to retract and detract, whatever the non-retract word is, extend and retract by twisting the back of this, and that would push the screw up. And they had two different versions. One was the screw was cut into the barrel, and the other one was the screw was a separate entity, and the separate entity screw often would break. So I think the screws on the inside of the barrel were an improvement, but I don't know that. Here's a Waterman 48, which is a number 4 meant that it was a safety pen, and the 8 is a number 8 nib. So this is a very large, as you can see, pen, and I'm not going to take it apart. They all had these cute little caps, short caps like this. Well, now it's time for the moment of truth here. I have been delaying doing this because I'm sort of afraid to, I don't know what I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of anything. Here's my Noodler's Boston safety pen. Now, I have put in it two things that did not come with the pen. One is ink. I used platinum carbon ink, which is a waterproof ink, and I replaced the nib that this came with a Waterman gold nib, but I haven't done anything else to it. It's, other than that, it's the way it came, essentially. And I bought it 2 years ago from Nathan Tardif himself. I've known Nathan personally, I've known Nathan for 35 years or so, maybe even more than that. And he and I would buy pens from a pen dealer that would go to all the pen shows, and Nathan and I would stay home and not go to pen shows, but we would always try to be the first one to Frank's house to buy pens from him, because he would come back with all this booty that Nathan and I wanted. Thank heavens, Nathan and I had completely different taste in pens. Only rarely, I think, we would have fought over who was going to own a particular pen. I wanted flexible nibbed Watermans, and he wanted stiff Schaefers. So there you go. Nathan, anyway, I bought this pen from Nathan a couple of years ago at the Boston Pen Show to try out, for one thing, and I had a number of artist friends who loved doing watercolor on top of an ink drawing, but they didn't want their ink to smear. I like my ink to smear, but they didn't want to have it smear. So I thought, well, let me try out this new this new Boston safety pen that Nathan is making to see if I can recommend it. I will put India ink in it, and I will use it. And if it doesn't leak and doesn't cause any issues, I would be happy to recommend it to other artists. So, I know you're all waiting for me. I'm waiting to uncap it as well. The only flaw that I have with this pen is that when you extend the nib out, and also when you retract it, when you pull the back of the pen back and the nib goes back down, every once in a while there's this little drop of ink that shoots out of the pen and lands right in the middle of your drawing, or nearly the middle, somewhere where you don't want it. So I always retract it carefully, and I aim it toward some other area other than where I'm working. So this may cause a issue or not. I don't remember the last time I used this pen, so this will be a surprise, but I have had ink in it for ever since I bought it. I never have taken the ink out. I've added more ink, but I've never completely washed it out. So here's the cap. There's no nib. You have to push the nib up carefully. And the nib should be all black because it's been submerged in the ink, and it is all black. And does it write? Look at it. It writes. It writes. Now, and I'll let it dry, and I'll try my watercolor brush on top of it and see if it smears. As you know, I'm not doing my scribble off-road test. Wesky called it off-roading, which is kind of a nice way to describe it, because it is essentially not following the rules of the road. It's not making letters. It's just making scribbles or calligraphic swirls or flourishes or whatever you might want to call it. It's essentially scribbling at speed. Normally when you write, you're trying to fit a lot of words on a page, so your letters are an inch tall or a half an inch or whatever they are, and you're going up and down like this, and you don't need to go very fast. Or you might be going fast, but it's not, there's enough ink up there to make it work. And I was going to tell you something else about why a pen would skip. A pen can skip for a number of reasons. The ink might be too thick. The feed might not be robust enough to keep the ink flow going or holding enough ink at the end where it's needed. Or the nib might not be pressed up against the feed to make capillary action happen. There's also other reasons why pens skip. The paper can also be a factor. There's a certain kind of paper that Cranes makes for letterpress, and that my ink just hates it. My pens hate it, my eye hate it. I don't know what's wrong with it, but it doesn't work. Also, if you're doing a drawing and your hand, the oils of your hand get on the paper, and you're drawing over an area where your finger or your hand had touched, it's going to skip, like it's doing right there. But I don't know why it's skipping right there. So let's just try. Okay, off-roading isn't working here. Now, I think the reason that it's not working is the ink is a little thicker than a normal water-soluble ink is because of that. So this does not pass the speed test, the Pierre Gustafson off-road test. But it does work for regular sort of hatching and drawing and writing. So now at some point I may try this pen out using regular ink, not waterproof ink, and maybe it won't skip at that point. The nib, as I said, is a Waterman nib from the 40s, gold Waterman nib, which I've replaced the steel nib that it came with, because I wanted it to be more flexible. The nib that came with it is perfectly fine. It probably had a little tiny bit of a flex in it, and it took me a while to find a nib that would work for this pen, and this era of Waterman pen worked. Nib worked for it. So, ta-da! So let's now pull this back, and no ink blobbed up. Screw this down, and then I'll put it back in my drawer up here and look at it in another year. See how it's doing. Let me get my brush out here and try seeing if this is waterproof. Where's my brush? Oh dear. Come on, here. Where did it go? Here it is. Okay. So this is dirty water again. Has a little bit of blue ink in it. So if you see blue, it's more the water than the ink. Okay, well, so much for that waterproof ink, huh? I think it's fine. This just hadn't dried enough. It is not bleeding. Whereas the non-waterproof ink is bleedy. So if you want to use a pen with waterproof ink, I still recommend this. It may skip if you do some off-roading on it. If you put regular ink in it, I don't think it would skip, but I'm not positive on that. I only have one of them, so I can only talk about this. See you later.